Our next speaker this afternoon, David Marler, for the past 4 years, has focused tirelessly his research efforts towards triangular-shaped UFO sightings. He even references what Dr. J. Allen Hynek said, in that in order to accomplish something in this field, you have to specialize. You have to specialize. And the triangular-shaped crafts is his specialty. This is what he specializes in. Here to talk about all of his research, please welcome to the stage David Marler.
Thank you, everyone. It's nice to be here. I want to thank John. I want to thank Colorado MUFON and MUFON International for allowing me to be here. There's a lot of good research being done, and I'm glad to share the podium with these other researchers that we've heard this weekend. I have an especially daunting task in the sense that I have the speaking engagement immediately after lunch. So I not only have the task of entertaining and hopefully educating, but trying to keep everyone awake at the same time. So in addition to that, I have a lot of material to cover. So I would ask that if we could refrain from any questions till the end, hopefully we'll have some time at the end, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. But as John mentioned in the introduction, I've been focusing primarily on triangular-shaped craft over the last 4 years. And I think whether, we're just beginning to enter into the UFO field with a general interest, or if we have actively investigated and researched this subject for decades, I don't think triangular-shaped craft are any stranger to us. I know Steve Rickmuth's presentation yesterday with UFO weather maps was especially interesting for those that caught that. Steve had a number of triangular UFO reports, as I'm sure you saw, scattered throughout the country. And certainly that is just a representative sample of the global phenomenon that we're dealing with these triangles. In addition to my research, I'll be sharing research from other researchers worldwide that I've been able to collaborate with. And I think it's very interesting. We've been receiving these reports on an increasing basis over the last 10 to 15 years. And in many of the documentaries, and when you listen to many of the skeptics, they'll state that this is probably just all something military because this is relatively new to the UFO phenomenon. Well, I'm here to hopefully set that record straight. And we're going to be looking at cases over the last 70 years involving triangular-shaped craft. And with that, what I'd like to do is go to the first slide. And this is the title, Detailed Analysis of the Historical Record. And, talking about all of the sightings is one thing, but let's put some numbers to it. National UFO Reporting Center statistics as of November 2004, this is when I started actually looking at some of the actual statistics. If we look at this, you have a wide variety of shapes and sizes. We all know that UFOs come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. Down here we have triangular reports listed. 2,782 sightings that the National UFO Reporting Center has collected since November 2004. The only number, statistic higher than that, was the rather vague category of light. But as far as any solid-shaped object is concerned, triangles by far, at least according to the National UFO Reporting Center statistics at that time, was by far the greatest. And what I found interesting was, compare that to the classic flying disc that we've all been used to over the years, 2,439. So just some numbers I'd like to throw out before we begin. And almost to underscore that fact, here's a newspaper article that I was able to gather. Saucers outmoded, Texan site flying arrowhead. Quite often with these triangular UFO reports, they're described in a myriad of different ways. They're described as triangles, deltoid-shaped objects, wedge-shaped objects, arrowhead-shaped objects. We're also going to hear a number of other descriptives as we go through some of these cases. But I thought that was rather interesting. But again, to kind of counter what some of the skeptics have said, I thought it was equally interesting that this report is from Dallas, Texas, January 6, 1953. For anyone that thinks triangles are something new, there's something to think about. And that was from the Daily Gazette, Berkeley, California, January 6, 1953. And that's just one of many newspaper articles I'm going to be sharing. In putting this information together, I've been basically over the last several years collecting collections from older researchers that are now retiring or have since passed on. There's a wealth of UFO information. I think anybody that caught Carl Feinst's lecture just prior to the lunch break would agree. Carl did a wonderful job of showing some of these historical cases going back to the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And there are very good organizations such as APRO and NICAP that unfortunately now have kind of gone the way of the dodo bird. And now MUFON is the only one that is here to really continue the work and continue the research. But moving on, you know, the big question is, okay, if these triangular UFOs are here, where do they come from? $64,000 question, right? This is an article I did with a local newspaper back in 2003 in Edwardsville, Illinois. And they did an interview, and they were discussing my investigation into the January 5th, 2000 incident involving St. Clair County police officers, which has been profiled in a number of documentaries. And we'll actually talk a little bit more about that. But they had stated in the article, is it us or is it them? And I think that's pretty much, that pretty much sums up the question. So what are the source of the flying triangles? As best as I've been able to estimate, there's three possible hypotheses. One, the most practical, it's United States military aircraft that people are seeing. It sounds very simple, straightforward, and it certainly sounds more logical than saying it's aliens from another planet here to invade us. However, when I think you look at the history of the reports and you look at some of the flight dynamics of these craft over at least a 70-year period, as far as I've been able to trace it back to, I think you're almost forced to conclude that some of these might be extraterrestrial in origin. But in all practicality, realistically, I think we might be dealing with a combination of both. I've had some conversations with some of the conference attendees over the weekend, and they, you know, I think we have to concede that some of these triangular-shaped craft might be military in origin. However, I think there's another party involved, and I don't think all these triangles have made in USA stamped on the underside of them. Well, again, there's a lot of arguments dismissing these accounts. B-2 stealth bombers, F-117A stealth fighters as possible explanations. I don't know about you, I've seen both. They make a lot of noise, and they're, you know, pretty identifiable as at least a standard type of jet propulsion type aircraft. And, you know, the reports date back prior to the development of stealth technology, you know, prior to the 1970s and the 1980s, as we're going to see. Then they also state, well, they're not B-2 stealth bombers or stealth fighters. They're probably experimental aircraft. On the internet, there's been a lot of references to the TR-3B craft, which, although it's an interesting story, you know, we have some supposed insider information pertaining to this type of craft, we have absolutely no evidence to support that this craft even exists. We have people that claim that they were involved on the project, but we have no tangible evidence to support that. And again, reports are spanning the globe, dating back at least to the 1930s. And the one takeaway I'd like you to leave with is that the triangles are nothing new. And I think by the end you'll see that. But the primary purpose of the research is to demonstrate the worldwide scale of these reports, demonstrate the historical nature of these reports, and use this as an argument against the notion that all of these triangle reports are you know, military aircraft, although some might be. Well, in doing the research, going through some of the archives, going through some of the old UFO newsletters and books, I stumbled across this article by W.A. Watson. This was published in the Flying Saucer Review, May-June 1959. And it's, as far as I can tell, the first article solely devoted to triangular UFO reports, or as they described them back then, unidentified deltas. And you have to ask yourself, if they're writing an article in 1959 about triangular UFOs, wouldn't that presuppose that they had cases prior to that time? And it's interesting, in the descriptions, they state that some of these triangles are as large as 300 feet in length. And doesn't that sound very reminiscent of the modern reports that we're receiving? Well, there was a follow-up article done by the same author 6 years later, and they described oftentimes that these flying triangles, or delta volants as they refer to them, as moving edge forward. In other words, the flat end of the triangle as the leading edge, and you know, with the apex trailing. And that's almost counterintuitive to typical aerodynamic principles. You would certainly think the pointed edge would be the leading edge of any typical jet fighter that we're used to looking at, or aircraft. So I thought that was interesting, and I've found several modern-day reports that correlate with that. Well, the UFO evidence published by NICAP, a seminal volume back in 1964, under commonly reported UFO types, they list triangles, triangular UFOs. So that's in 1964. I do want to mention Omar Fowler in England. He lives in the Derbyshire area, and he works with a group that investigates UFOs. He's a veteran UFO researcher, has lots of files that he's accumulated, and he's published 2 monographs in recent years, The Flying Triangle Mystery and Flying Triangle UFOs, The Continuing Story, and he's done an excellent job of documenting cases. However, the cases are primarily from England, although he does have a few foreign reports, but the cases are also primarily recent. Some of his earliest cases go back to the 70s. Then I'd like to mention Bob Pratt. Of course, we lost Bob Pratt back in November 21st, 2005. And I was actually in correspondence with Bob on this research at that time when he passed away. And he was able to provide a lot of information, which I'll cite during my presentation. And he noted that reports are worldwide, and his focus was primarily from 1960 to 1990, looking at the number of reports. And his primary sources were MUFON, CUFOS, SOBEPS, the Belgian UFO group, and the UFO News Clipping Service put out by Lou Farish. Well, this presentation is derived from hundreds of triangular UFO reports, and I can't emphasize enough that given the limited time that we have today, I can only begin to touch on the amount of data that I've collected. But I do refer you to the symposium proceedings because I do have a lot of cases that I don't have time to discuss that I placed in my paper. The reports are worldwide, and we're going to be going back to 1936. And if we have time, actually I have an audio segment I'd like to play from the witness that claims to have observed a triangular UFO in 1936, and hopefully we'll have time for that. And again, some of this information is available for review at www.dbarkertv.com, who investigated the January 5th case along with myself, Darrell Barker, in St. Louis. Well, one fact I'd like to mention is that there have been major sightings or waves of sightings involving triangular UFOs. These are just not random reports. One that many people are not familiar with, the Kansas-Missouri wave of November 18th, 1980, one triangular UFO flew over a wide sweeping area of northwestern Missouri and northeastern Kansas. And this was in the National Enquirer. This is an article actually written and investigated by Bob Pratt. And there was major activity involving one or more flying triangular craft. And we're going to touch on this case several times throughout the presentation because there were so many good eyewitness reports, and many involving law enforcement officers, as you'll see. But the objects were sighted during a 4 to 5 hour period as one or multiple triangles cavorted about the sky in this general area. And it was a very interesting wave of sightings. And of course, a more well-known case involves the Hudson Valley wave, which was investigated by Bob Pratt, J. Allen Hynek, and Philip Imbrogno. And it reports of boomerang-shaped craft as well as flying triangles over the Hudson Valley, and sightings primarily from February '83 to July of 1986. Then we had the Belgian UFO wave, which I think most of us are familiar with, from 1989 to 1991, and in which case the Belgian Air Force fully acknowledged that these craft were out there and that they had no control over these things. And the sightings there were primarily from '89 to '91. The Phoenix Lights case of March 13th, 1997, multiple UFOs sighted that night, apparently, based on some of the final reports involving either a flying triangle or a large flying wing. And of course, there's been a lot of research done on that case. And then the case that really drew me into this on a personal level was the January 5th case in St. Clair County, Illinois, interviewing the police officers and the other witnesses in that particular case. Dramatic case, and I'm here to tell you, Ken Storch could vouch for this. Law enforcement officers are great to interview regarding UFO sightings. They're about the most no-nonsense guys I could ever interview. They're straight to the facts. They don't let their emotions try to cloud their judgment when they're trying to recount an experience with a UFO. And we just had tremendous cooperation with the law enforcement officers in this case. But it was interesting that this triangular UFO flew within 1 mile of Scott Air Force Base. And I know a lot of people tend to lean towards the fact that the DoD, Department of Defense, are probably flying these craft. But I would like to state that although it was sighted within 1 mile of Scott Air Force Base, there were no reports, absolutely no reports of this thing taking off or landing at Scott Air Force Base. And it came in from the northeast, came down towards the southwest, and then increased in altitude and disappeared back to the northeast. And again, the sequence of events was documented on police dispatch tapes, and those are rather interesting to listen to if you've heard those on some of the documentaries. Well, I found it interesting. I was interested in the Belgian wave already, having joined MUFON in 1990 when all of that was going on. And then I had this Illinois case in January 5th, 2000. And I found it interesting. There were so many parallels, both with the UFOs and the witnesses. The shape of the objects were quite similar. Lights on the objects, absence of noise in most cases, flight characteristics, the ability of these things to hover, rapidly accelerate, stop abruptly, make flat, sharp, angular turns. And then with the witnesses, primarily police officers on patrol at night from neighboring towns communicating with each other during the time of the actual sightings. So I started using that as kind of a springboard, if you will, to look into the historical material and see what I could find. And there was one more parallel between Illinois and Belgium. They both had cases prior to that time. I found in the literature, doing my research, Flying Saucer Review, Case Histories, 1973, there was actually a wave of sightings in July of 1972 in Belgium, and it was investigated by SOBEPS, the same organization that investigated the latter wave of UFO sightings. And it was interesting also, it was actually around some of the same towns and principalities of Belgium. So I thought that was rather interesting. And again, the descriptions were quite similar. Typically 3 large bright white lights, and then sometimes actually witnesses discerning a triangular platform associated with those lights. And then in Winona, Illinois, I stumbled across a sighting, low flying triangle in Illinois from July 28, 1979. And that could be just a perfect little title describing the January 5th case that happened later. And this was a single witness case involving a large triangular object. And I do like to mention this is not a photograph of the object. That was just a little mark indicating where the witness saw the object. I've had a lot of audiences in the past straining their eyes trying to take a look at that. It's not a photograph of the UFO. But this is what we're going to focus on in the remainder of the time we have together. These are the common characteristics that I've found, and these correlate rather closely with some of the common denominators that Omar Fowler has found regarding these cases. And we're going to take each one of these in turn. I'll describe each one, and then we'll actually go in looking at 2 or 3 examples worldwide over the last 70 years. And again, I can't, unfortunately, even begin to touch on the amount of data we have regarding these. But these are what we're going to be looking at over the next hour. So let's take the first one. Beams of light emitted. Quite often, in many cases, these triangles will often emit beams of light either in the form of sharp penetrating beams, as in lasers, or large spotlights that often shine down on witnesses or on objects on the ground. And this is just kind of a representative sample of some of the cases I have on file. And just look at the geographic distribution, if you will. Denmark, Venezuela, Austria, Puerto Rico, Russia, Belgium, Scotland, Japan, England. I mean, if these are United States military aircraft, they really get around, don't they? And I found it interesting, you know, here we have a case from 1957 all the way up to 1998. And again, these are just a small sample. But what I'm going to do is take each one of these that are highlighted and just real quickly touch on them. Unfortunately, because of time, we don't have a lot of time to go in depth. But Falcon State, Venezuela, this is from the old APRO files, the APRO bulletin from 1966. Multiple eyewitnesses observed a triangular-shaped object in the early morning hours, and the object moved quickly, and then hovered, and this would repeat itself multiple times. And witnesses stated it was almost as if this thing was looking for something, the way it would move around and then stop. And they stated that it would give beams of light off in different directions periodically, often towards the ground. And they almost thought it was in some type of search pattern. We have a case from South Dakota, which I'd like to read a little excerpt of. And this is from the APRG reporter, Aerial Phenomenon Research Group reporter, which was by Bob Gribble back in the 60s. Of course, Bob later founded the National UFO Reporting Center. And I'd just like to read a little segment right here. It goes on to state that the object was as low as the telephone wires, which are one of the characteristics we'll talk about later, low altitude flight. And it was reported that the road and the area around the car was bathed in a light bright enough, and the witness is quoted as saying, quote, "so you could drive without headlights," unquote. And the couple also reported a humming sound and a feeling of numbness. And while the area was lit up, a funny feeling went through my body, according to one of the witnesses. My wife said her face seemed to go numb. After veering near the car, the object took an erratic but rapid path into the distance and eventually went out of sight. So that's just one example. Then we go to another example in 1978, Dilhorn, England. And in this particular case, it states that the witnesses claimed that a huge dark object passed overhead as they traveled through Dilhorn and fired a blinding beam of light at their car. And it goes on to state that the craft seemed to be about several hundred yards wide and shot off into a cloudless sky. And they go on to state also that there was an absence of sound. Well, we have, of course, the Belgian wave. This was documented in the MUFON journal. And beams of light were observed to be emanating from the underside of this craft, often illuminating cars and buildings and people. And there were other beams of light also described as laser beams. There was an interview with some of the Yupon gendarmes, the police officers in the village of Yupon, that described these red laser beams shooting across the sky horizontally and also shooting down towards the ground. Rather interesting. Well, one of the cases Omar Fowler investigated is from April '96. And this involved witnesses seeing a flying triangle around 10:30 at night. And this is a sketch based on witness description where there was a large triangle making a low humming sound, and it shone a beam of light towards the ground. And it was only estimated to be moving about 30 to 40 miles per hour, which is another characteristic we'll be discussing, the fact that these things move very, very slowly. Well, another example of characteristics that are common to these reports involves 3 bright lights at each corner. There are a myriad of different lighting characteristics associated with these craft, but more often than not, the predominant lighting characteristic are these 3 large bright lights at each corner on the underside of these craft. And you know, we can speculate as to what they are. Are they part of the propulsion system? You know, a lot of people have argued, why are these things lighting themselves up like Christmas trees if they don't want to be seen? You know, maybe it's an inherent part of the propulsion system. I don't know, and I hate to speculate. But here's a case, and doing research like this, it's really gratifying to come across an article that has a big banner headline that states, "Mystery Flying Triangle is spotted flashing over the north." Especially interesting considering it's from England, 1960. So I thought that was rather interesting. And it goes on to state that the object was seen and described as triangular formation of lights with a red light in the center, which is often accompanied with these 3 bright white lights. And it was seen by people in Consett, South Shields, Fowden, and Finham, Newcastle. And rather an interesting description. It states that reports were sent to the Ministry of Defense, but of course nothing came from that. We go to France, 1977, Brettnock, France. And the witness here states that I saw 2 luminous headlights, and then I saw a 3rd headlight, and the object appeared like a triangle with a red light in the middle. I didn't hear any noise. You know, again, we're just going to briefly go through some of these just to give you an example. This one I love. Some of these newspaper article headlines are just humorous. It's unidentified flies but doesn't scare cops. You know, it gives the community a warm, fuzzy feeling, I'm sure. And goes on to state that what they saw was a soundless, triangular flying object, twice the size of a full moon, with a white light on each tip and red lights in the center. And again, quite similar to what we were just describing in the other cases. And it also goes on to state that he said that they got out of their car to watch the object, and the craft circled them twice and shone lights down on them, similar to the characteristic we were just talking about. So rather interesting. Pensacola, Florida, 96, a little bit more modern report here. Multiple witnesses saw a large flying triangle hovering over a highway. Witnesses stated it had a bright light at each corner and a blinking red light in the center, and it hovered for an estimated 20 seconds before moving away. If these objects do not have the characteristic lighting pattern, I found a number of reports which basically involve the entire underside or the undercarriage of these triangular UFOs being illuminated in a solid color. And I found a number of cases, as you can see, going back to 1958 New Zealand, where this is exemplified. And this one I thought was rather interesting. For those that caught Ruben Uriarte's presentation yesterday, he showed a video clip. Do you recall that clip of the triangular UFO? Apart from this little characteristic here, that's a pretty darn good representation of what was captured in that video clip that he showed us yesterday. So I thought that was rather interesting. But again, here's a description, and they called it an arrowhead, and many of the reports will describe them as such. And these were cited by 2 soldiers that were on maneuvers at the time in England. And unfortunately, with some of these accounts, we don't have exact locations, so all I can do is provide the information that they had in the report. But in this particular instance, the entire object appeared to glow a red color, then changed to orange, and then brilliant white as it accelerated away. And typically, the orange or the reddish are the typical color that these objects are illuminated with, although I did have a case from Missouri where the entire underside almost had kind of an electric corona blue flash to it, which was rather interesting, but typically they're usually red or orange in color. And here too, seeing a large triangular-shaped object which had a reddish-orange glow over the embankment. That was 1979 in England. Just moving through these quickly. Smithton, Illinois, I interviewed this gentleman back in '96. For any amateur astronomers out there, August 12th, Perseid meteor shower. And this gentleman was actually lying on his back patio looking straight up at the sky, enjoying the meteor shower. And while he was watching this, I don't know if you can see that too well, he had sketched this little red triangle that he said scooted across the sky in that fashion, going from south to north. He said in a completely linear movement, and he said there was completely no noise. He estimated it was relatively high altitude, but he said it was a solid dark red glow as it passed overhead. And that was around 9:40 p.m. Central Time. Well, a really interesting or unusual characteristic associated with these craft are the fact that sometimes they have detachable lights or objects, and this is a rather interesting characteristic. I found this particular report in newspaper archives near where I live in southern Illinois. This is from the Breeze Journal, and it describes a sighting by a group of teenagers and one adult back in 1970. And it goes on to state, right down here at the bottom, it states, it was described as triangular shaped with orange and white lights, and a second object appeared to emerge from it. The objects were observed by the group for about 10 minutes. Then they reported that it was definitely not a plane or a star, and that it moved in an erratic manner. And so that's just one case of objects being emitted from a triangular shaped object. Going back to the famous 1980 wave over Kansas and Missouri, we had a number of witnesses. 2 men observed a flying triangle near Fairview, Kansas, out in this area right here in the northeastern corner. Both men described smaller objects actually being shot out or ejected by the parent craft, and they described them as round in shape, having a bluish glow with a red flickering on the side. Rather interesting. And then, of course, November 29th, 1989, this was the pivotal date that really was a precursor for all future activity in Belgium regarding the 1989 to 1991 wave. Multiple gendarmes from multiple surrounding cities observed these objects. But in this particular instance, at 1845, 2 gendarmes observed a red light detaching itself from a triangular object near the town of Kortenbach. And this was very close to a dam that was located near Kortenbach. And another set of gendarmes just a little bit later, less than an hour later, near the town of La Calamine, observed a similar occurrence. Well, another characteristic is quite often these triangular UFOs are accompanied by non-triangular UFOs, which really adds to the unusual character of these reports. 1958, Rio de Janeiro, again, we're going back to the old APRO files, the APRO Bulletin, 1958. 9 p.m., 2 UFOs shot from the clouds. This was observed by many people near the Santos Dumont Airport as well as the surrounding town. And they apparently made a series of violent maneuvers over the town and over the airport. Then they disappeared into the clouds. The first object was described as triangular in shape, and it was being chased by the second object, which was round in shape, essentially playing a game of cat and mouse. We have July 1981, Macomb, Mississippi. A woman and her 3 children observed a large object shaped like an arrowhead, again, that descriptive. It appeared to be metallic like chrome, but flat, without a glow. And the trailing behind it was a separate red light, which followed the leading object. Later, they saw the same object again, only the red light was completely absent. They didn't know where it went. Meopic Falls, New York, 1984. This was a rather interesting case, and I think you'll appreciate the parallel with another case that I'm going to share with you. Not only did we have an unusual triangular craft with an appendage, here's a lateral sketch of what the object looked like. This is rather unusual in comparison to some of the other reports we have. But a family was driving home. They were about 2 blocks from their house when they observed this object hovering very slowly and very low altitude over the homes. And while they had this object in view, suddenly off from the side comes a secondary UFO shaped and drawn like this, described as a rectangle or a box with 4 bright white lights at each corner. And then eventually one moved off, and then the other one also departed, leaving the witnesses rather bewildered. But I would like to share this sketch with you, and notice the striking parallel to a report. Now, this is 1984 New York. Here's a sketch, and this is from Mufon, the same evening that I referenced earlier, November 29th. Albert Kreutz observed a flying triangle from his position at the Mufon dispatch headquarters. At 18:15, he observed it shoot off into the sky at a steep angle, so the triangle left. It was replaced by an object which he sketched that looked like this. Now, side-by-side comparison, isn't that rather interesting? New York, 1984, Belgium, 1989. So not only do we have comparison with the initial craft they saw, the triangle, and now we have this companion object that also bears striking similarities. So I thought that was rather interesting. Probably the biggest characteristic that leaves an indelible impact on the witnesses is the sheer scale of these objects. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the reports. You know, they're on the internet, they're in books, They're in newsletters, the MUFON Journal, for example. The sheer size of these things literally dwarfs the witness. And for people that live near airports that are used to seeing commercial aircraft fly in and out of airports, they said there's just absolutely no comparison. I had one retired Missouri law enforcement officer tell me, he goes, Dave, he said, you couldn't look at it. He goes, you had to look from left to right to get the entire thing in view. And that description just really stuck with me. I think that really conveys it. We're not talking about Venus. We're not talking about a weather balloon. We're talking about a large object. In fact, if you recall, one of the Phoenix Lights witnesses described the fact that you could hold a newspaper up at arm's length and it would not cover the size of this object. That's how large it was. And I thought that was rather interesting. Well, we had another case involving police officers. This is rather similar to the January 5th case in Illinois in that it involved multiple police officers at various locales. This is back in 1977 in Tennessee, and it's interesting. I presented this at the Eureka Springs UFO conference this past April, and I got talking to some of the Memphis, the Tennessee MUFON representatives there, Marcia Prince and Mark Gilley, who are the state directors for Tennessee. And they described that they actually have one of these witnesses that has frequented their meetings in recent years that still sticks to his story back from 1977. But this is a fairly common descriptive, as I'm sure many of you have heard. Triangular UFO, big as football field. And for those of you that don't exactly accept the National Enquirer as newsworthy, I found a local newspaper, the Memphis Press Scimitar, that ran a similar story. So we do know it is factual. And actually that was investigated by Bob Pratt. So, you know, Bob had good journalistic integrity. And 5 law officers report UFO over Shelby, and here's a description of what they saw. Rather interesting. Well, again, the Kansas-Missouri wave. These are just different witness descriptions from various locales. It was at least as big as a football field. The size was something tremendous. This thing was obviously pretty big, and it was blocking out some stars. Again, it was the size of a football field. It was rather huge, at least twice as big as a 747, maybe bigger. January 1983, South Wales, England. That triangle is no plane, says expert. And rather an interesting description regarding that particular sighting. And there were actually several reports in this specific area in England. And it goes on to state that it must have been 300 feet across, so it could not have been an aircraft. The thing I really don't understand is that it made no noise. Again, absence of sound, despite the low altitude flight and large size. Now, these objects have the ability to hover and rapidly accelerate. And by rapidly accelerate, I mean literally from a dead stop. And we have some very good eyewitness reports regarding that. Here's another example of one of those newspaper articles that, as a researcher, when you stumble across it, you just get a big grin across your face. Flying triangle hovers over Cobalt, and this is from 1954, Canada. And it goes into a very lengthy description of the UFO. And I won't go into the entire description, but I would just like to read an excerpt. It states that it came very low and hung right over a mine that was in the area. It states that then it started to go up and down slowly, then shot high into the sky at a tremendous speed. Then the witness is quoted as saying, fantastic, just fantastic. And there were numerous people, at least 6 witnesses that described this triangle as it hovered over this area, and it had bathed the area in an intense bright light. But that's from, again, 1954, which I thought was rather interesting. 1965, Valladolid, Spain, we have a report. This was actually by a number of priests at a university, and they observed this UFO for a fairly lengthy period of time. They actually had time to run in and get a telescope that was there at one of the classrooms, bring it out and observe it. And this is their detailed sketch of what they observed through the telescope. And the object remained stationary in the sky over the school, and then it slowly began to rise and then quickly disappeared. So you got one more report. And if you can't believe a priest, who can you believe? I mean, come on. Now, another report we have is from 1983, Dover, New Hampshire. And this involved a sighting around 9 p.m. The object had huge white lights at the corners, and again, a red light in the center. And again, these cases oftentimes have 3, 4, maybe even 5 of these characteristics, which I think really emphasizes that we're possibly dealing with the same or similar type craft. And it made a faint whirring sound. It had the ability to hover and accelerate rapidly. And an interesting little note, power outage was reported at the time of the sighting. Coincidence or something else? January 5th, 2000, this object flew from the town of Lebanon to Shiloh in this area here near Scott Air Force Base in 2 to 3 seconds. The law officer, who unfortunately now is deceased, Officer Ed Barton with the Lebanon Police, told me on location, he said, "Dave, the thing was hovering right above me." He goes, I reached into the squad car to get my radio. He said, because our local, the ones that they wear aren't that reliable. He said, I reached into the car. He goes, I'm looking at it. I reached down, came up. He said, the thing was hovering above me before I reached in the car. When I came up, which had to be at most 2 to 3 seconds, he said I could see the object streaking away off in the distance. And just seconds later, we had a Shiloh police officer state that the object was hovering over Shiloh. Now, the distance was 6 miles, and Darrell Barker, independent researcher who provided a lot of information for me, estimated the speed was calculated at 3,600 miles an hour. And this sounds striking, but for those that have been doing UFO research for a long time, we know that these things do have just absolutely incredible acceleration rates. And the interesting thing is no sonic boom was generated, which also was similar to the Belgian case, if you recall. And in that particular instance, of course, we had the F-16 radar data, which captured the fact that the UFO over Belgium was tracked by the F-16s initially at 7,000 feet, moving at 150 knots. Then in seconds, it climbed to 10,000 feet at 570 knots, then dropped to 500 feet in 5 seconds, moving at 990 knots, over 1,000 miles an hour. And this combination of speed would have killed a human pilot, speed and maneuverability, and again, no sonic boom detected. So what are we dealing with these objects? Well, another characteristic, one that Ed Barton had described, which I'll come to in a minute, is the fact that these objects, unlike typical aircraft, do not bank, and they usually maintain a horizontal position in the sky, even when they make turns. Case from 1953, we have a Goodyear Aircraft Corporation employee who observed a UFO pass overhead at an estimated 3,000 feet altitude, and it was described as grayish blue, shaped roughly like an equilateral triangle, and described as rotating around a central axis as it would turn and as it would maneuver. And again, the Kansas-Missouri wave. I thought these were some rather interesting descriptives that kind of emphasize that characteristic. An Adair County deputy sheriff and fellow deputy observed a flying triangle make a 180-degree turn without turning around. In other words, it literally just pivoted around and then went back in the same direction from whence it came. And then we have that he further stated it would be able to stop and spin around without having to do what normal aircraft would do to turn around. Rather interesting. And Officer Ed Barton, one I just mentioned earlier, described the same thing. Immediately before the rapid acceleration, he said this thing almost directly above his head without making a sound just pivoted in the direction of the southwest, and then the rapid acceleration kicked in. No sound, no sonic boom. Well, silent flight is another thing. If you can imagine an object, let's just say for the sake of argument, the size of a football field hovering above your head at 500 feet, you would expect to hear something, and in many cases you do not. Many of the witnesses state that there was an absence of sound. And we have a case going back to 1955 from the APRO files. This is in Cairo, not to be pronounced Cairo, but they pronounce it Cairo, Illinois. A woman observed a triangular-shaped object at 9:30 p.m. She observed it low on the horizon and stated that there was no sound or vapor trail. And the witness stated that the object appeared to be about 10 times as long as the width of a TV antenna on a neighbor's house. So we're talking a fairly large size. But that was 1955, triangular report. This is one that I was so gratified to receive from Lou Farish. He sent this to me because he knew of my research. Case from 1960, Connecticut, triangle that flies sighted along shore. Flying triangle seen in state. And I would ask you, if you're familiar with some of the modern day sketches of these triangle reports, this is a case from 1960. Isn't this very similar to the reports we received today? 3 bright lights at each corner and a revolving or flashing red light in the center. And this is a very detailed account. I wish I could read the entire thing, but I'm just going to touch on it very briefly here. It goes on to state that basically the object was flying and made absolutely no sound. And I don't know if I can find that particular report. But the witness observed it along with his wife. Here we go. And they go on to state, I don't want the publicity, he says. I'm just dying to know what it was that I saw. And I thought this was interesting. I was inclined to the belief that it was a new type of aircraft the government is testing. And that's what we're hearing from witnesses today. And you're going to hear later from a witness from 1936 that makes a similar statement. But it states that the eeriest part of the whole thing, he said, was that the flying object made no sound, absolutely no sound. Then we have a case from Welland, Ontario, Canada. Another UFO this week. As you could tell, this was during a wave of UFO sightings in this particular area. The witness states that it was triangular in shape with red, white, and blue blinking lights, and the object made no sounds, according to the witness. Well, slow speed, as I'd referenced earlier, is a characteristic that we often see with these cases. You have a large object of appreciable size moving very slowly, and you would think that it would have to have more speed to generate lift, again, based on aerodynamic principles. This is an interesting one, and this is kind of unique, described it as a coat hanger UFO, kind of a inverted cone or triangular object here, and they observed this dark metallic coat hanger shaped object during early afternoon hours, which is unusual. Typically, most of these are around dusk or at night, but oftentimes we do get cases of these triangles being reported during daylight hours. And this was received in a letter by Flying Saucer Review back in 1973, and it provided a description of this object slowly moving about in the sky, going back and forth from two various locations before it zipped away at incredible speed. And again, the Kansas-Missouri wave, we actually had an FAA radar technician during the night of November 18th, 1980, track the object on radar for a momentary period of time. And he was quoted as stating, "I tracked it once for a few minutes, and I estimated its speed to be in the neighborhood of 45 miles per hour at the time that he tracked it." Relatively slow for a large aircraft. 1994, near Brindley Ford, England, a man was driving and he observed a silent triangular object in the sky, estimated to be 20 to 30 meters wide, not as large as some of the other ones that we hear, and the object's speed was estimated to be 30 to 60 miles per hour, and it was estimated to only be 400 to 500 feet away from the witness. Close encounter by its very definition. Superstructure involved. Again, conventional aerodynamics, we usually see smooth, sleek aircraft. B-2 stealth bombers, F-117As, although they have the acute angles, it's a smooth surface. Yet, in many cases, these triangles have superstructure, which would be almost counterintuitive to that notion. This is a report that I actually heard reference to in a book, The New UFO Sightings, which was published back in the 70s, early 70s. And I actually went to the newspaper archives near my home and was able to retrieve this from the microfilm. And it describes two teenagers that were driving near Bartelso, Illinois. And it goes on to state that they observed these lights moving really funny back and forth as they were driving on this county road. And this was at night, and suddenly a lighted object appeared right there by us, she said, and they were both very frightened. The witness is quoted as saying, "It was triangular shaped. I could only see the bottom of it. It was real big. The object's underside appeared to be constructed of metal beams," she said. Now, this is particularly interesting because this is only 20 miles from the January 5th, 2000 sighting that we had, and one of the police officers, Officer Dave Martin of the Shiloh Police Department, described almost the exact same description. He stated it was almost like there was plumbing or metal beams or almost like building blocks on the underside. He says it was not smooth by any stretch. So I thought that was rather interesting. And then Omar Fowler, Derbyshire, England, reports in 1993, two witnesses traveling in a car, again, and they observe a flying triangle. And isn't this interesting? It says they first observed a bright light in the sky, but within a split second, a flying triangle appeared right next to their vehicle, similar to the case from Illinois. It was suddenly right there by us. A structure of some type was visible on the underside of the craft, if you can see these little beams or bars on the underside. And this sighting lasted for a full 10 minutes, fairly lengthy. This is Dave Martin's sketch from January 5th, 2000, and again, he described building blocks or pipes on the underside of the craft. And this is a clip from Daryl Barker's documentary, and I don't think that translated too well to where you can see those details. But low altitude flight is another characteristic we need to examine regarding these craft. They're very large, oftentimes very silent, and very, very low. And the first case, 1972, Long Island, New York, rather interesting case. We had some campers out in a park near Long Island, and they observed initially one object which passed overhead, and it was estimated 1,000 feet or less. There was a single row of rectangular lights observed on the bottom edge, and two antennas with a connecting line or object. And this is kind of atypical for the reports, but I wanted to share that one with you because I thought that was rather unusual, that characteristic. But that's just one example of it being relatively close, again, 1,000 feet. Then I found this rather interesting article that was chock full of good information from 1975. This is the Cross Country News, Fort Worth, Texas. And it goes on describing a wave of UFO sightings in the year 1974, and not only over the United States, but also Canada. I just want to read a little excerpt here. It states that last November, a rash of reports of an object flashing red, white, and green lights were made by police and state troopers as it swept through U.S. and Canada. The object was tracked on radar and chased unsuccessfully by two F-106 flight interceptors. Hundreds of sightings came to police as the object reportedly cruised, often at treetop level, over the US and Canada. Sightings were reported 2 days in Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Michigan. All described the object as flashing red, green, and white lights. Several described it as having a triangular shape. Rather interesting. Another characteristic we have here is the fact that oftentimes they may be seen around nuclear power plants or electrical substations. And in this particular instance, this was investigated by veteran UFO researcher George Fawcett and submitted to Flying Saucer Review. Daylight sighting around 3 p.m., and this object was only an estimated 300 feet altitude and was actually hovering directly over a nuclear energy site. And it was estimated to be about the size of a stealth bomber. And again, the object was glowing reddish-brown in color. St. Clair County, we have another officer here, Craig Stevens, from Millstadt. This was his sketch of the object, and he stated that the object was about 500 feet and it was huge. If you've heard the police recordings, you'll actually hear him actually say those words, and you hear the emphasis in his voice describing how low and how large it was. Well, erratic movement is another one. We're not talking about aircraft going from point A to point B. Quite often, these things have a very erratic maneuverability and flight characteristic. 1971 in Michigan, former Air Force man observed a triangular object with triangular-shaped UFO with large white lights on the bottom and smaller red lights around it. And the object was silent and made sharp turns at fantastic speed. Pensacola, Florida, 2 witnesses observed a triangular UFO. Very erratic maneuvers were associated with it over the Gulf of Mexico. 2 witnesses were an ex-United States Air Force security policeman and U.S. Army chopper pilot, and they provide a very detailed account of their sighting, which in the interest of time, I'll move forward and skip. Blunt end forward movement. If you recall the initial report by Watson back in the 50s, they described this. We've seen this with modern day reports. At 17:30 hours, a woman and her daughter in Belgium observed an enormous flying triangle. Had 3 powerful white lights, the typical lighting characteristic at the corners, and a red flashing or rotating light in the center. And it traveled slowly and soundlessly at 500 meters altitude. It traveled with its wide side towards the front, as a witness described. Rather interesting. I'd love to see something like that in person. 1995 over Bredsall, England. This is again another case investigated personally by Omar Fowler, observed by a retired engineering designer. And you can see in the sketch here indicating the direction of movement with the flat end as the leading edge. Also interesting is the fact that we have this huge chunk taken out of the middle. So I thought that was rather interesting. Not all of the reports fit a common characteristic or a common mold. There are those outliers which have unusual characteristics that set them apart. Electromagnetic effects certainly are associated with many UFO reports, and certainly the flying triangles are no different. We have a couple of reports here I'd like to share with you. 1982, Davies Valley, California, a couple were camping when they were awakened around midnight, and their bodies were responding to the static electricity. They said it's like every hair on their body was standing on end. And they noticed that above them was a giant object shaped roughly like a manta ray. And it was at least 200 feet across. It made a humming sound, and it slowly passed over the couple and headed to the east. And I think the campers promptly headed to the west. 1995, Repton, England. Man observed 2 flying triangles through binoculars from his home in Repton. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. He observed red, green, and white flashing lights. Then a flying triangle flew directly over his home, which apparently caused his TV picture to distort, which was noticed by his wife. And he noticed that the flying triangle flew with a jerky stop-and-go motion. Again, that erratic movement. Well, we just talked about a case where they saw 2 triangles. In many of these cases, these objects do not fly solitary, but fly in groups, usually 2 or more. And I'd just like to share real quickly a number of those. This is a case out of the Project Grudge Air Force files, and this one occurred July 24th, 1949. This is a sketch I put together based on the description, but this private pilot was flying a Piper Clipper, I think, aircraft over Idaho when he noticed this formation of triangular objects moving over and then in front of him and flying in and out of his flight path. And the objects turned without a bank or a skid. They just moved in unison together. And no turbulence were noted, which he thought was unusual. He stated that he began to brace for impact because he thought that this was going to cause some type of wake, but it didn't. His plane flew fine. However, the engine began running rough and started to idle. And upon examination, once he landed, the spark plugs were found to be shorted out and burned out. Rather interesting case, 1949. This is a rather interesting one as well. 1950, Huntsville, Alabama. This is from Project Blue Book, and this was based on the witness description. Redstone Arsenal employees observed a polished aluminum object at 5 p.m. shaped like a bow tie, and apparently it consisted of 2 flying triangles. The reason I say that, and you're probably curious, why are you showing us a bow tie UFO? As the witnesses observed this bow tie moving across the sky, if you can imagine these 2 halves of the bow tie, they stated as the object moved across the sky, one of the objects pivoted, continued to move, and then moved back into position. So it was almost like 2 flying triangles flying in tandem with one another. I thought that was rather interesting. This is a really interesting report that I found. This was actually in some microfilm of NICAP files. This was some of their scrapbooks and news clippings that they had. This is an International News Service headline, Berlin, July 3rd, 1954. 300 West Berliners were reported today to have seen 3 triangular-shaped flying saucers on several occasions during the past few weeks. Rudolf Hermes, a director of Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, said all the witnesses described the objects as shiny. He said they claimed the saucers seemed to pull away at incredible speed and in a zigzag motion, that erratic flight pattern again. And it goes on to state that American and British officials have begun an investigation. Rather interesting. 1954, Germany. 1966, Victoria, British Columbia, 2 triangular objects seen over the Saanich Inlet. Observed 40 to 50 feet above the water, again, low altitude. And they were about 2 minutes that they observed these. Then they moved off slowly and gracefully. Complete absence of noise. No noise was heard. And there were multiple reports at this time, as the article goes on to state, of flying triangles in that area in the year 1966. This is just one I like to show you because I like the little graphic here. 1983, Swansea, South Wales. Meteors never, say all the UFO spotters. Those don't look like meteors to me. But this is an example of a witness that observed these 2 triangular UFOs moving close together in her field of view. Well, there are some cases that do involve sounds. Many of the reports, they describe an absence of noise despite the witness being fairly close. However, there are a number of reports of sounds being emanated from these triangular-shaped craft. This is one I really have wanted to share with you. This is courtesy of Peter Davenport at the National UFO Reporting Center. And you may have heard Peter some years back discuss this case. This was October 15th, 1936, near Eklutna, Alaska. And this was based on a recorded interview with the witness, Mr. Holger Berg, and Peter Davenport back in November 9th, 2000. And Mr. Berg passed away not too shortly thereafter on January 27th. But the sound he described was like a low whining sound. And I'll tell you why I have this little graphic up here in just a minute. But if everything goes well, hopefully you can hear this little audio clip.
It was in the fall of 1936, 27 miles out of Anchorage at a place called Eklutna. And another fellow and I were hitchhiking to town. It's kind of stupid since the temperature was below 20. However, we were 6 miles at least away from the camp. We saw this light and we said, oh boy, a truck's coming. Well, anyway, all of a sudden we realized this thing was up in the air and we couldn't figure out what it was. And before we knew it, it was right above us and it had kind of a blue-green light in it and it made a sound. And I never heard that sound again until I heard the first jet engine shut down, kind of a low whining sound. And this fellow, his name was Peterson, him and I dove into a snowbank, and we watched it.
Could you hear that? Basically, I think we got cut off there for some reason, but he goes on to describe it, and he said that initially it looked like a cigar-shaped object, but he said once it moved away and it was overhead, he said it was wider at the back than at the front, and he said it was basically like a flat iron. So I just wanted to bring this graphic up here to show you. I would consider that roughly a triangular-shaped craft. And this is 1936. Peter Davenport, by the way, had multiple conversations with this witness, and it's easy to discount a witness of this man's age. I think he was in his late 80s. And it's easy to discount them and say, well, you know, they have faulty memory or he's suffering from dementia. Peter had lengthy discussions with this man, and he assured me that, David, he goes, this man was in complete control of his mental faculties, and he had a very crisp, clear memory of many things. And so he vouched for the man's credibility and his accuracy in recounting details. We have another case involving a sighting over another state park, And this was over Patapsco State Park, Maryland. And witnesses first observed this object disappearing to the southeast. They were with a large group of people having a picnic. Then they observed a similar object coming from a different direction. So there were apparently more than one. And it moved over them from the north. And the object was up to 200 feet along each side. And the interesting thing is the sketch here, which you can't see too clearly, had these large windows or bank of windows on the side, which when you compare them to the January 5th case, here we go, a little bit better description. This is quite similar to what some of the witnesses described with the January 5th triangular UFO. And one of the witnesses even stated that they thought they saw the figure of a person or a being inside one of the windows. But it moved very slowly and hovered at times, and they said it made a sound like a quiet wind or a quietly rushing waterfall. Rather an interesting description. And it had 3 white lights at each corner. The Belgian wave, a number of witnesses had various descriptions. They described the objects as having a hissing noise, like the slight noise of a wind, like that of a sewing machine, like the sound of a ventilator, or an electrical motor sound. So rather interesting. Well, I have 2 more little areas I'd like to get into. Those are the characteristics that I've been able to find that are true in all of these reports, the majority of these reports, which at least establishes a profile for us. I do want to just touch on a couple commercial aircraft and military aircraft sightings of triangular UFOs, which are rather interesting. The first one is this one, 1950, Burbank, California. I just recently came across this one about 2 or 3 months ago. This occurred at 7:32 p.m. This flying wing, as it's described in the article, dove at a commercial airliner over the vicinity of Van Nuys and San Fernando, and it was described as a flying wing. And it just goes on to state that a mysterious, brilliantly lighted object that dived at an airliner near Burbank had aeronautical authorities digging out their flying saucer data again. Lockheed Operations reported no aircraft in flight and failed to show any aircraft in the area. The object, which looked like an 85-foot-long flying wing without a fuselage. And it goes on to state that we didn't feel any prop wash as it moved in front of the aircraft. And the pilot states that his co-pilot also saw the object. So rather interesting, 1950. This was a very popular case back in the 50s for any veteran UFO researchers that may recall it. Back in 1954 over the area of Labrador, this was cited by a British Overseas Airways Corporation crew, as well as about 1/3 of their passengers, at least 12 or more. They described this large triangular-shaped object the size of the Queen Mary. The sighting lasted for 18 minutes, generated a lot of publicity at the time. I have a lot of newspaper articles pertaining to this. And a jet interceptor was actually dispatched from Labrador, a United States jet interceptor. However, just before the interceptor moved into the area, the object disappeared. And rather interesting because this object was also sighted with smaller objects that were flying in tandem with it. We have a case from 1995, the Pennines, England, and this made headlines, as you may recall. This was in a few of the documentaries. British Airways Boeing 737 in near miss with triangle at Manchester Airport. Timothy Good and some of the other British researchers investigated this fairly thoroughly. But it was a Boeing 737 flying from Milan to Manchester, and the flying triangle was basically headed straight for the aircraft, and they had to make evasive maneuvers. It passed very close by the right-hand side, and their CAA investigated the case, their version of the FAA, and stated that they could find no likely explanation for the event after a year-long investigation. Well, military encounters. I have a very interesting case from 1952 over the North Sea. This was during a major NATO exercise called Operation Mainbrace, and it was basically a large non-violent show of force against the Soviet Union, showing the strength of the NATO alliance, and they were doing naval maneuvers. This actually is a newspaper article of another UFO sighting, flying saucer joins in Mainbrace. This was a small orb, metallic orb that was sighted, flying near some of the naval vessels. But another one involved a flying triangle sighted by a Danish naval destroyer, Willemoes, while on NATO maneuvers. And this was described as blue-green in color, traveling at 1,500 miles per hour. And other sightings occurred during the operation. I actually have a copy of the news teletype from that case, and I just would like to read some excerpts here. It says, the first officer of the Danish destroyer Willemoes has reported to Mainbrace headquarters in Oslo that he observed a mysterious flying luminous triangle last Sunday night when cruising just north of Bornholm during the first phase of the Mainbrace maneuvers around the Baltic island. Today, the destroyer paid a short visit to Copenhagen Harbor, and Lieutenant Commander G. Schmidt Jensen told his story. I was in charge on the bridge, and the captain had just turned in. The sky was clear when suddenly we heard a whistling sound and saw a flying triangle pass at high speed, and that's how it's listed here, flying triangle. It was luminous with a greenish light and flew with one corner pointing forward. From its rear, it jetted 3 rays of fire backwards, which is rather interesting. I have no idea how high it was, so that I could not judge either its size or speed, but I believe it went at more than 1,500 kilometers an hour. It disappeared in a northwesterly direction. And it goes on to state that the witness states, I have studied some astronomy, and I have also learned to identify most of the modern planes, and I am sure it was neither. It says the mysterious sight was observed by several officers on board and by a press photographer standing near the lieutenant commander, but without a ready camera. The captain on board considered the report too substantial to be neglected and has reported it to main base headquarters in Copenhagen, from where it has been passed to Sir Patrick Brine's headquarters in Oslo. And that's one of the actual teletypes from the military on that case. Rather interesting. Another case, January 28, 1953, military pilot sighting, F-86 Saberjet pilot observed the sighting of 2 triangles flying together. Again, triangles seen in multiples. And the triangles performed a series of unusual maneuvers and changed colors before outrunning the F-86. This was a rather interesting case, a wave of sightings over the area of Denmark, 57 to 58, which I found in Flying Saucer Review from 1958 issue. And it's interesting because they quote the newspaper, Danish newspaper BT, and I don't know if you can read that, but it states, triangular spaceships have also now appeared in the southern part of Jutland. From every part come reports of mysterious phenomenon in the sky towards the late evening. All witnesses state with certainty that conventional aircraft are not involved. And this is from 57 to 58, and they're having multiple sightings. The Danish Defense Intelligence Network, it goes on to state in this article, was fielding a number of such reports from Denmark. But after reviewing the data, I think we have a more informed perspective regarding these triangles. Again, I have a lot more information that I just don't have time to present. But we do have a detailed profile of this UFO type. These are some of the characteristics which are very common, and I'm sure you know of reports or you have your own sightings which maybe you can compare to some of these characteristics. There are variations between the reports. I don't mean to suggest that all of these reports are identical. There are variations. But there are very specific characteristics which are common in many reports, and many cases include multiple characteristics, as I'm sure you saw, which is even more interesting. But in conclusion, not all flying triangles seem to be military in origin, again, because of the global nature and because these things have been reported for at least 70 years. And reports of flying triangles, again, are nothing new, contrary to what many skeptics will argue. And the increased frequency of reports is new, but we have to ask ourselves, is this representative of the actual activity? And looking at reports, we only usually get 1 out of 10 reports, it's estimated. So, just because we get an increase in reports, is there more activity, or are people just more inclined to report UFOs now as opposed to before? I don't know. But if the sightings continue to increase, what does the future hold? I would like to thank APRO, NICAP, MUFON, Flying Saucer Review, Daryl Barker, Omar Fowler, Bob Pratt, Ray Nelke, Peter Davenport, Les Tree Sinclair, Lou Farish, the UFO Study Group of Greater St. Louis, who was nice enough to recently give me their archives and files, and John Schuessler was a founding member of the UFO Study Group in St. Louis when he lived there prior to the incorporation of MUFON, and there's just a wealth of information I've been able to gather from their files. And I also want to thank Colorado MUFON for allowing me to be here, and I want to thank you for your time today as well. Thank you. And it looks like we actually have 10 minutes for questions if anybody has any questions. And I can't see beyond about 4 feet because of the light, so.
I've got a question.
Okay, there we go.
The mic's working. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I noticed the rash of sightings over Belgium were like 2 years.
Right.
Why do you think the length of time was so high in that area?
It's interesting. I mean, we could generalize that question to the UFO subject in general. We look at these areas that have had waves of sightings or flaps, UFO flaps, and that's one of the big questions. Why do we get these concentrated areas of sightings in particular areas? I don't know. It's interesting. They had, about a year or two later, they had a wave over northern France, and initially the skeptics were stating, well, these must be military, or it's a cultural phenomenon because we're not getting reports in any other countries, and a year or two later they started getting reports in northern France. But in answer to your question, I don't know. Similar to Carl Feinst's research, though, a lot of these triangles have been reported in Belgium heading back, either coming in or heading back out towards the North Sea. And Omar Fowler has a number of reports in England where he has told me that oftentimes these things are coming from and heading back towards the North Sea. So I don't know if there's a connection with water, you know, similar to the work that Carl Feindt was looking at.
There seems to be a preponderance of them staying in areas for a very long period of time. My question is, particularly in Belgium, I think Unsolved Mysteries did a special on it. There's like one single picture they have of this thing over 2 years. I can't understand that.
They have some other pictures, but they're
no videos.
They're not impressive.
What about videos? Didn't somebody get curious enough to get a video camera on it?
I've seen some videos, but unfortunately, again, the photographic and the video evidence, as far as I'm concerned, has not been very good. To be honest, what Ruben showed yesterday was probably the most impressive video of a triangular-shaped object that I've seen. But I think we need to definitely get better video footage, better photographic evidence.
Can't understand it.
Especially in this day and age with cell phone cameras and everything else.
One last question. Does it seem that these triangular crafts, they seem to go over a lot of populated areas more so than the other craft, Phoenix Lights, Belgium. Are they attracted, Unsolved Mysteries mentioned the fact that Belgium, seen from space,
they're a highway system.
Yeah, like a highway system. Do they seem to be attracted more to lights, or maybe that's the reason?
I don't know. I mean, some of these are fairly rural areas. The case of the retired law enforcement officer in Missouri, they were out in a very rural area of Missouri. They were actually out deer hunting that entire day, and they were back cooking some food when they saw this huge, immense wedge-shaped or flying wing move out over this clearing. And again, his statement was, you couldn't look at it, Dave. He goes, you had to look from left to right to view the entire thing. So they're being sighted everywhere, rural areas, populated areas. And I would defer to Steve Rickmuth's UFO weather maps. You know, I love the fact that he's actually plotting this data visually so we can see where this activity is occurring.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your research and for sharing it with us.
Thanks, Tom.
And I'd like to know if you found any cases at all of flying triangles being associated with missing time among witnesses or abductions.
I had a question asked at the Eureka Springs conference on that. I found a handful of reports. Now, I should emphasize, though, that of all the reports that I shared, I did not get any of these from the internet. Now, I know there's a number of such reports on the internet involving possible abduction and flying triangles. What I mainly did was really pull from the historical material, the old books, the old newsletters, the MUFON database, National UFO Reporting Center. There are such reports out there, but as you can see, there's so much information just in trying to get the visual characteristics and flight dynamics, you know, quantified that I kind of, you know, put that aside and didn't focus on that. Mainly, I'm just trying to get a profile established of what these craft look like and how they behave. But that might be a future lecture.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just curious because I saw something on there that said not all flying triangles are military in origin, and I was like, some of them have been like thought to be military in origin.
I'm willing to concede that some of them more than likely are military. I had a conversation with someone just earlier prior to the lecture, and we were discussing that.
Really?
I think we have to be willing to concede that some of these might be.
Even the giant ones?
Possibly.
But
okay. My question to that, I mean, I'm skeptical with regard to that because, you know, from a logistical standpoint, if they have these objects that are of this size, where are they storing them? How come we don't have reports of these things landing and taking off at military bases?
Right.
And, you know, we don't have that many reports. There's a few, but they're sketchy reports, and I haven't been able to follow up on those. But I'm just willing to acknowledge the possibility. But I think you'll agree that some of these are very unusual reports.
Definitely.
And the fact that they've been cited for 70 years worldwide, I think it calls into the question the military explanation.
All right, great. I think you answered my question.
You answered a similar question a few minutes ago, but the relationship between experiencers and triangle sightings bears a little bit more scrutiny. We've got a couple of cases in the Minnesota MUFON files where the person, first of all, there was one I call a selective viewability, where a number of people see it, but it's in a very populated area where there should have been thousands of people seeing it. In one particular case, the woman was watching this triangle pass over her where she was standing, and then it passed over a very heavily traveled highway, and it was not too long after rush hour. So there should have been myriads of people seeing this thing, and they wouldn't even have had to really look up. It was a treetop level, classic what you were describing.
Well, and again, that's typical of a lot of the other UFO reports received.
And yet few people actually saw it.
Right.
The other thing was that this particular person was an experiencer, and I've had several other reports from people of very similar things where they first see a light, and then they look again and they see a big black triangle.
It's the triangle.
And all three of the particular cases that I'm thinking of, the experiencers were quite sensitive, quite psychically sensitive, or whatever you refer to. I call them perceivers as much as anything else. But I'm wondering if there's a theme that you've discerned, or...
Again, I haven't looked at those reports, but it would be interesting to take the abduction-related flying triangle reports and their visual descriptions and compare it to people that did not claim to be abducted by aliens and compare it to that database and see if there's any correlation.
So I was wondering if you've looked at, in sighting investigations, have looked at the history of the witness themselves.
I haven't, but that's definitely something I might need to branch out and do. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Similar to a question a gentleman a few minutes ago just asked. I just want to know if there's been any correlation. One of the best explanations I've heard of these triangular flying triangles was that it might be a stealth blimp.
Right.
Have you heard anything about that?
Oh, yes, yeah.
And, can you expand on that at all for me?
Well, I mean, the stealth blimp, basically that originated from an article, I believe, in Popular Mechanics. They had a drawing of that, and there's been some stuff on the internet. As far as I know, again, we don't even have firmly established that this thing even exists. We have no concrete photographs. We don't have any official documentation that a stealth blimp exists. I think it was all based on basically things that were on the drawing board. But when you look at some of the flight characteristics associated with these, absence of flight, for instance, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I was just recently visiting my mother that lives near St. Louis, and they were having a large sporting event, and the Goodyear blimp flew over. And we were indoors with the doors closed, the air conditioner running, and we heard this droning sound, just drowning everything out. And I kind of looked, and being a UFO investigator, my first thing is to run outside and look up. And sure enough, it was the Goodyear blimp. But we heard that. Blimps are not silent. I mean, they still have to have a means of propulsion. In many of these cases, people are seeing these things reportedly 500 feet above their head, and there's complete absence of sound. In many cases, they say you can hear the crickets. I mean, that's how quiet it is, which it's just amazing.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Hello.
I've heard about a case of a worker on an oil rig in the North Sea who had previously been a member of the armed services, and his function in the armed services was that of an aircraft spotter. And he'd actually won several competitions at spotting aircraft. And he alleges that he saw the quintessential black triangle being refueled in midair by a KC-135 and being escorted by a couple of F-16s. Are you familiar with that?
And again, I'm familiar with that case, and that's why I leave it open that some of these craft may be military.
Yeah,
but that was he had actually a very good sighting, and being a professional observer as well.
Yes, and one other question, have there ever been any teeny tiny
small
triangles sighted?
Yes, I don't have time to get into it. I'm actually on my last minute, but Rendlesham Forest, a prime example, if you recall, Sergeant Penniston described a small black triangular object moving in and out of the trees in Rendlesham Forest.
Thank you.
Thank you. And my time is up, so if we have one last...
He took my question. I was going to ask about small ones. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you.
We're going to just take a quick 15-minute break or so.